Some debts don't disappear with time. They just wait for the right day to be remembered. Eleanor Brooks spoke the words softly as she adjusted the collar of her faded brown coat and stepped out into the cool Georgia morning. The sky hung low over Maple Ridge, a quiet town where everyone claimed to know everyone, yet somehow still managed to overlook the people who mattered most. At 72 years old, Eleanor moved carefully but with dignity, her silver curls tucked neatly beneath a knitted hat she had owned for more than a decade. In one hand she carried a reusable grocery bag filled with canned soup and fresh bread. In the other was a small bouquet of white lilies wrapped in brown paper. Every Thursday followed the same rhythm. She stopped at the church food pantry, visited a few elderly neighbors who lived alone, and ended the afternoon at the cemetery on the edge of town. Most people barely noticed her. She was simply Miss Eleanor, the elderly black woman who smiled at everyone and never seemed to ask for anything in return. Across town, Officer Ryan Mercer sat inside his patrol SUV parked beneath the shadow of a water tower. The vehicle's air conditioner hummed steadily while he sipped coffee from a paper cup and watched traffic roll by. Ryan liked control. He liked the way people straightened up when they saw the badge on his chest. He liked the silence that followed his questions. In a town this small, power didn't need to be loud. Sometimes it only needed a uniform and a reputation. A radio crackled beside him. Routine chatter. Nothing urgent. Nothing interesting. His eyes drifted toward Main Street where the weekly farmers' market had begun drawing crowds. Families moved between colorful tents. Children laughed as musicians played near the courthouse steps. Everything looked peaceful. But Ryan had learned long ago that appearances meant very little. Several blocks away, Eleanor paused near a crosswalk and watched a young boy sitting alone beside a brick storefront. He couldn't have been older than 12. His clothes were worn, his backpack rested beside him, and his eyes remained fixed on the sidewalk. Most pedestrians walked around him without slowing down. Eleanor stopped. She always stopped. She reached into her grocery bag and pulled out a sandwich she had packed earlier that morning. "You look like you could use some lunch, sweetheart," she said gently. The boy hesitated before accepting it. His expression softened. "Thank you, ma'am." Eleanor smiled. "Everybody needs somebody looking out for them." The church bells rang 11 times in the distance. A breeze stirred through the square, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and baked pies from nearby vendors. For a moment, the town felt warm. Safe. Familiar. Then the sound of a police siren cut through the air. Heads turned. Conversations faded. Officer Ryan Mercer's SUV rolled slowly toward the curb. The boy's smile vanished instantly. Eleanor noticed it. She noticed the fear. And for the first time that day, a feeling settled quietly into her chest. Not fear for herself. Something else. Something older. Something that felt like a memory returning after years of silence. As the patrol vehicle stopped and Ryan stepped out beneath the bright morning sun, Eleanor tightened her grip on the bouquet of lilies. The white petals trembled slightly in the wind. Neither of them knew it yet, but by this time tomorrow, the entire town would be talking about what happened next. Eleanor Brooks had lived in Maple Ridge longer than most of the buildings still standing along Main Street. People knew her face, but very few knew her story. To the cashier at the grocery store, she was the polite woman who always counted exact change. To the church volunteers, she was the first person to arrive and the last to leave. To the children who passed her small white house every afternoon, she was the lady who kept bird feeders hanging from her front porch and never forgot a birthday. But the truth was that Eleanor carried an entire lifetime behind her gentle smile. Her home sat at the end of Willow Street beneath 2 towering oak trees. The paint had faded over the years, and the wooden steps creaked whenever visitors came by, but the place felt warm. Family photographs covered the walls. Books filled old shelves. A grandfather clock stood in the corner of the living room, ticking steadily through every season. Eleanor had once shared that house with her husband, James Brooks. He had been gone for nearly 15 years now, yet his presence lingered in small details. His favorite coffee mug still rested inside the kitchen cabinet. His worn leather Bible remained beside Eleanor's reading chair. Every morning she touched the frame of his photograph before beginning her day. Some habits never left. Every Thursday afternoon, after finishing her volunteer work, Eleanor drove 10 miles to Rosewood Cemetery. The routine never changed. She brought fresh flowers, cleaned a small headstone, and spent a few quiet minutes speaking words only the wind could hear. Most visitors assumed she was there for her husband. They were wrong. The lilies she carried today were not meant for James. The grave she visited belonged to someone else entirely. Someone whose name had nearly disappeared from public memory decades ago. As she walked through the cemetery gates later that afternoon, sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees and painted long shadows across the grass. Eleanor stopped in front of a modest gray headstone near the far edge of the property. She knelt slowly, arranging the flowers with practiced care. The inscription was simple. No grand title. No long message. Just a name and a date. Eleanor brushed a few fallen leaves away and smiled softly. "I still remember," she whispered. "Even if nobody else does." For a moment she remained there in silence. The breeze rustled through the branches overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called. Then Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small silver object wrapped in a handkerchief. She looked at it briefly before returning it to her pocket. Whatever it was, she guarded it carefully. Back in town, Officer Ryan Mercer watched body camera footage inside his patrol vehicle while parked behind the police station. His expression remained unreadable. He paused the video, rewound it, then watched it again. Something about the elderly woman from the town square lingered in his thoughts. Not because she had done anything remarkable. Quite the opposite. She had remained calm. Too calm. Most people became nervous around authority. Eleanor Brooks had simply looked at him with the quiet confidence of someone who had already seen much worse things in life. Ryan leaned back in his seat and stared through the windshield. Outside, clouds were beginning to gather above Maple Ridge. And somewhere beyond town, unseen by everyone, events already set in motion years ago were slowly moving toward them. The following morning arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds that seemed to press down on Maple Ridge. A light drizzle coated the sidewalks and turned the streets silver beneath the early light. Officer Ryan Mercer parked outside the police station and stepped out carrying a paper cup of coffee. The town was just beginning to wake up. Store owners unlocked front doors. Delivery trucks rolled through downtown. Nothing looked unusual. Yet Ryan could not shake the feeling that something was slowly moving beneath the surface. Inside the station, the atmosphere felt different. Conversation stopped when he entered certain rooms. A few deputies exchanged glances they quickly tried to hide. Ryan dismissed it. People always talked. That was life in a small town. He placed his coffee on his desk and opened a folder containing reports from the previous week. Numbers. Complaints. Routine paperwork. The kind of work he hated. Authority felt satisfying. Paperwork did not. Across town, Eleanor Brooks sat near her kitchen window watching raindrops slide down the glass. A kettle whistled softly on the stove. The familiar scent of chamomile tea filled the room. She appeared calm, but her eyes carried a quiet distance this morning. The silver object wrapped inside the handkerchief rested on the table beside her. After several moments, she unfolded the cloth and revealed an old motorcycle badge. Time had dulled the metal, but the engraved wings remained visible. Eleanor traced her fingers across the surface with gentle care. Memories moved behind her eyes like old photographs. Long roads. Summer heat. Laughter. Promises made decades earlier. Then she folded the handkerchief again and placed it back into a drawer. Some chapters of life never truly ended. They only waited. Meanwhile, 30 miles outside Maple Ridge, a black touring motorcycle rolled into a roadside gas station. The rider wore a weathered leather jacket darkened by years of sun and rain. His gray beard moved slightly in the wind as he removed his helmet. Frank Donovan studied his phone screen while standing beside the fuel pump. A single text message remained open. No greeting. No explanation. Only a name. Eleanor Brooks. Frank stared at the screen for several seconds. His expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. Something deeper. Something personal. He slowly placed the phone into his pocket and looked toward the distant highway stretching east. Rain clouds gathered above the horizon. Without a word, he finished fueling the motorcycle and climbed back into the saddle. The engine rumbled to life beneath him. Back at the police station, Ryan received a call from a local business owner complaining about parking violations near Main Street. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but when he hung up, another call immediately appeared. Then another. Small problems. Endless interruptions. By noon, irritation had settled into his voice. He walked toward the front lobby and stopped. A receptionist was staring through the glass entrance doors. Ryan followed her gaze. Nothing appeared unusual at first. Just wet pavement. Passing traffic. Rain drifting across the courthouse square. Then, faintly, somewhere beyond town, a low mechanical sound rolled through the air like distant thunder. The receptionist frowned. Ryan listened. The sound disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Neither of them knew that the first motorcycle had already crossed the county line. By late afternoon, the rain had settled into a steady rhythm against the rooftops of Maple Ridge. Water streamed along curbs and gathered in shallow puddles beneath streetlights that flickered on earlier than usual. Eleanor Brooks stood beneath the awning of the church food pantry helping volunteers carry empty boxes inside before the weather worsened. Her movements were slow but purposeful. She thanked every volunteer by name. She always did. As the last box disappeared through the doorway, she noticed the same young boy from the previous day standing across the street beneath a bus stop shelter. His backpack rested at his feet. His shoulders were tense. Eleanor crossed the street with an umbrella in one hand. "You should not be out here in this weather," she said gently. The boy offered a nervous smile. "I am okay, ma'am." Eleanor studied him for a moment. Children had a way of hiding worry behind brave faces. She recognized it because she had seen it many years ago in people who had far more reason to be afraid than they were willing to admit. Before she could say anything else, the familiar glow of police lights reflected across the wet pavement. A patrol SUV rolled toward the curb. The boy immediately looked down. Eleanor noticed that too. Officer Ryan Mercer stepped out and adjusted his rain jacket. The drizzle beaded across his shoulders. "Afternoon," he said. His tone sounded casual, but his eyes remained fixed on the boy. "Everything all right here?" Eleanor answered before the boy could speak. "He is just trying to stay dry until the rain lets up." Ryan glanced between them. "Several businesses reported someone matching his description hanging around downtown all week." The boy opened his mouth as if to explain himself, then stopped. Eleanor saw his hands tighten around the straps of his backpack. "He has not caused any trouble," she said. Ryan's expression hardened slightly. "Ma'am, I am handling this." The words hung in the air between them. Rain tapped softly against the shelter roof overhead. Cars passed through the intersection with tires hissing across wet asphalt. For a moment nobody moved. Then Eleanor stepped forward. Not aggressively. Not defiantly. Simply with the quiet confidence that had unsettled Ryan before. "Sometimes people need help more than suspicion," she said. Ryan exhaled through his nose. "And sometimes people need to follow instructions." The boy stared at the ground. Nearby pedestrians slowed their pace. A few watched from storefront windows. Maple Ridge was the kind of town where attention gathered quickly. Eleanor remained calm. "There is nothing wrong with kindness, Officer Mercer." Ryan looked away briefly before returning his gaze to her. Something about her composure irritated him more than an argument would have. Most people backed down when authority entered the conversation. Eleanor never seemed interested in winning or losing. She simply stood her ground. The church bell rang once in the distance. The sound drifted through the rain. Ryan adjusted the radio clip to his shoulder. "I suggest you head home, Miss Brooks." Eleanor nodded slowly. And I suggest you remember that every person you meet carries a story you do not know. Neither spoke after that. Ryan returned to his vehicle. The boy remained silent. Eleanor opened her umbrella and began walking away through the rain. But as she disappeared down the sidewalk, Ryan found himself watching her longer than he intended. Somewhere deep in his memory, a feeling he could not explain had begun to stir. And across the county line, more motorcycles were quietly heading toward Maple Ridge. The rain finally stopped just before sunset, leaving Maple Ridge wrapped in a damp silence that felt unusually heavy. Water dripped from storefront awnings. Reflections shimmered across empty sidewalks. Inside her small house on Willow Street, Eleanor Brooks sat beside the living room window with a book resting unopened in her lap. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. Normally the sound brought comfort. Tonight it felt different. Almost like a countdown. A sudden knock interrupted the quiet. Eleanor looked toward the front door. Another knock followed, firmer this time. She rose slowly and crossed the room. Through the glass she recognized two uniformed officers standing on her porch. Neither smiled. Eleanor opened the door. "Good evening," she said calmly. The younger officer shifted uneasily while his partner held a folder beneath one arm. "Miss Brooks, we need to ask you a few questions regarding an incident reported downtown." Eleanor glanced at the folder, and then at the officers. "You are welcome to ask." The younger officer looked as though he wanted to say something else, but remained silent. Moments later, a patrol vehicle sat outside beneath the street lamp while curious neighbors watched from their windows. News traveled quickly in Maple Ridge. Faster than the weather. Across town, Officer Ryan Mercer stood inside the station reviewing paperwork. A local business owner had submitted a complaint claiming someone had interfered with police activity near the bus shelter the previous afternoon. The accusation was weak. The details barely made sense. Even so, Ryan signed the document and placed it into a growing stack of reports. His jaw tightened as he worked. He told himself he was simply following procedure. Yet a small voice somewhere in the back of his mind kept reminding him that Eleanor Brooks had done nothing more than show compassion to a frightened kid. He ignored the thought. Outside the station, darkness settled over Main Street. Store signs flickered on. Traffic thinned. The town seemed ready for an ordinary evening. Then a dispatcher hurried across the room carrying a printed message. "Sheriff's office received multiple calls," she said. "People reporting motorcycle groups moving through neighboring counties." Ryan barely looked up. "And?" "Large groups." Ryan shrugged. "They are using public roads." The dispatcher nodded and walked away, but concern lingered in her expression. Back on Willow Street, Eleanor sat quietly in the rear seat of a patrol vehicle. She was not upset. She was not angry. Through the windows she watched familiar houses pass beneath the glow of streetlights. One of the officers driving occasionally glanced into the mirror, as though expecting a complaint. None came. Eleanor simply folded her hands and looked out at the darkening town. After several minutes she spoke softly. "Do you know what fear does to people?" The younger officer looked back. "Ma'am?" Eleanor smiled gently. "It makes them forget who they are." Neither officer answered. The vehicle continued toward the station. Above Maple Ridge, low clouds drifted across the moon. Far beyond town limits, engines rumbled along the highway. One motorcycle became 5. 5 became 12. 12 became dozens. Their headlights cut through the darkness in a long moving line stretching across miles of open road. And at the front rode Frank Donovan, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of Maple Ridge. The police station felt unusually quiet after midnight. Fluorescent lights cast a pale glow across empty hallways while rainwater continued dripping from the edges of the roof outside. Most of Maple Ridge had gone to sleep hours earlier, but Eleanor Brooks remained awake. She sat alone in a small interview room, her hands folded neatly on the table before her. The room was plain. Gray walls. A metal chair. A clock whose steady ticking seemed louder with each passing minute. Yet Eleanor appeared completely at peace. Through the narrow window beside the door, a young deputy occasionally glanced inside. Each time he looked, he found the same thing. No frustration. No fear. No anger. Just quiet patience. It unsettled him more than any argument could have. Eleanor slowly reached into her coat pocket and removed a small photograph. The edges were worn from decades of handling. In the picture stood a group of young men beside a row of motorcycles beneath a bright summer sky. They were smiling, laughing, full of life. Near the center stood a much younger Eleanor. For a long moment she stared at the image. Her reflection blended with the faces in the glass covering the photograph. The years between then and now seemed to disappear. Somewhere down the hallway, a radio crackled softly before falling silent again. The deputy noticed Eleanor looking at the photograph and finally stepped inside. "Family?" he asked gently. Eleanor lifted her eyes and smiled. "Something like that." The deputy nodded. He sensed there was more to the story but did not press further. Before leaving, he hesitated. "For what it is worth, ma'am, I do not think you belong here." Eleanor's smile deepened slightly. "Sometimes life puts people exactly where they need to be." The deputy left without another word. Outside, the wind brushed against the station windows. Clouds drifted slowly across the moon. Time seemed to move differently tonight. Across town, Officer Ryan Mercer sat alone in his office. A desk lamp illuminated stacks of paperwork, while the rest of the room remained in shadow. Sleep would not come. Every time he closed a report, another thought surfaced. Eleanor's voice. Her calm expression. The strange certainty behind her eyes. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking Main Street. The town looked peaceful from here. Empty sidewalks. Dark storefronts. A few traffic lights changing for nobody. Yet an uncomfortable feeling continued growing in his chest. It felt less like worry and more like anticipation. As though something long forgotten was approaching. Miles away on a dark stretch of highway, dozens of motorcycle headlights moved through the night like a river of white light. Engines rumbled steadily beneath the stars. Frank Donovan rode at the front without speaking. The men and women behind him maintained formation with quiet discipline. No one laughed. No one shouted. They were not traveling for excitement. They were traveling for a reason. Near dawn, they stopped briefly at a roadside diner. Coffee steamed from paper cups. Maps rested across a table. Frank unfolded a weathered photograph and placed it in the center. The same photograph Eleanor had been holding only hours earlier. Several riders lowered their heads respectfully. One woman touched the edge of the picture before stepping back. Nobody needed to explain why they were there. They already knew. Outside the diner windows, the first hint of morning appeared on the horizon. Frank folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into his jacket. Then he looked east toward Maple Ridge. "It is time," he said quietly. Within minutes, engines came alive once more. And as the first sunlight touched the clouds above Georgia, the long line of motorcycles began moving toward the town where Eleanor Brooks waited in silence. Sunrise arrived over Maple Ridge in bands of pale gold and silver. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean and glistening beneath the morning light. Shop owners opening their businesses paused when they heard the sound. At first it seemed distant, almost mistaken for thunder rolling across the countryside. Then it grew louder, steadier. Dozens of engines moving together with unmistakable purpose. People stepped onto sidewalks. Curtains shifted in windows. Conversation stopped. Along the eastern highway leading into town, a long line of motorcycles appeared beneath the rising sun. Chrome reflected flashes of light across storefront glass as rider after rider entered Maple Ridge. They moved in disciplined formation, either speeding nor drawing attention to themselves beyond their sheer number. By the time they reached Main Street, nearly everyone in town was watching. Inside the police station, Officer Ryan Mercer looked up from his desk when the first reports came over the radio. Another dispatcher hurried toward the front lobby. A deputy glanced through the glass doors and froze. "You should probably come see this," he said quietly. Ryan stepped outside. The sight waiting for him immediately drained the confidence from his expression. Motorcycles lined both sides of the street. Men and women wearing weathered riding jackets stood calmly beside them. No one shouted. No one argued. Yet their presence filled the entire block. Ryan counted more than he could easily track. 40. Then 50. Maybe more. At the center stood Frank Donovan. His gray beard moved slightly in the morning breeze as he removed his gloves. The years showed in his face, but so did something else. Respect. The kind earned over a lifetime rather than demanded in a moment. Ryan walked forward cautiously. "Can I help you?" he asked. Frank studied him for several seconds before answering. "We are here for Eleanor Brooks." The name seemed to ripple through the crowd. Several townspeople exchanged surprised looks. Ryan folded his arms. "And why exactly would so many people come here for one elderly woman?" Frank reached into his jacket and removed a photograph. The same photograph Eleanor had held in the interview room. He handed it over without a word. Ryan examined the faded image. Young riders. Old motorcycles. Summer sunlight. And Eleanor standing among them. "This was taken 46 years ago," Frank said. "Back when most of us were young and believed we would live forever." Ryan looked up. Frank continued. "A charter bus carrying veterans and riders crashed during a storm outside Birmingham. Roads were flooded. Emergency crews could not reach us for hours. The street had become completely silent now. Even passing traffic seemed to slow. Most people drove past," Frank said softly. One woman stopped. Ryan stared at the photograph again. "Eleanor?" Frank nodded. "She spent the entire night helping strangers. She brought blankets, food, coffee. She sat with people who were scared and alone. Some of the men in this photograph survived that night because she refused to leave." Several riders lowered their heads respectfully. One older woman wiped a tear from her cheek. Frank's voice remained steady. "We never forgot. Every year we stayed in touch. Every year she told us the same thing. Help somebody when you can. That was Eleanor." Across the room inside the station, the young deputy who had spoken with Eleanor the night before quietly opened the interview room door. And for the first time since this began, Maple Ridge started to understand that the woman they thought they knew had been carrying a remarkable story all along. The morning air felt different now. What had begun as curiosity across Maple Ridge had transformed into something quieter and far more powerful. Respect. People lined the sidewalks watching as the riders remained gathered outside the station. Nobody was causing trouble. Nobody was demanding anything. They simply stood together, united by a shared memory that stretched back nearly half a century. Inside the building, Eleanor Brooks slowly stepped into a hallway after the interview room door opened. The young deputy offered a gentle smile. "Miss Brooks, there are some people here to see you." Eleanor adjusted her coat and followed him toward the lobby. The moment she stepped through the front entrance, the world outside seemed to pause. Frank Donovan saw her first. For a second, the years disappeared from his face. He looked like the young man from the faded photograph again. Eleanor stopped beneath the morning sunlight and stared at the crowd gathered before her. Dozens of familiar faces looked back. Some older. Some carrying gray hair now. Some leaning on canes. Yet she recognized them all. Frank walked forward and removed his hat. "Morning, Eleanor." A soft smile touched her face. "Frank." Neither moved for several seconds. Then Frank shook his head and laughed quietly. "You always did have a way of finding trouble." Several riders smiled. Eleanor chuckled. "I seem to remember most of that trouble coming from you." The tension that had hung over the town began to dissolve. Across the street, townspeople watched with growing amazement. They had spent years seeing Eleanor as the sweet elderly woman who volunteered at church and delivered food to neighbors. Now they were discovering another chapter of her life entirely. Frank reached into his jacket and removed a small wooden box. The surface was worn from age. He handed it to Eleanor carefully. She opened it and stared at the contents. Inside rested a silver pin identical to the old badge she kept wrapped inside her handkerchief. Her eyes softened immediately. "You kept it," she whispered. Frank nodded. "All these years?" For a moment, emotion flickered across Eleanor's face. Not sadness. Gratitude. The kind that only appears when old promises survive the passage of time. Nearby, Officer Ryan Mercer watched everything unfold from the station steps. The confidence he normally carried seemed noticeably smaller now. As more stories emerged, people began sharing memories. One writer spoke about how Eleanor had sat beside his hospital bed after the accident decades ago. Another remembered receiving letters from her during difficult years. A third described how she quietly organized fundraisers for struggling families without ever taking credit. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Everywhere Eleanor went, she left people better than she found them. Ryan listened. The realization settled heavily inside him. He had spent days viewing Eleanor through reports, assumptions, and authority. Yet the people standing before him knew something he had completely missed. Character was not measured by status. It was measured by impact. Then the young boy from the bus stop appeared at the edge of the crowd. He looked nervous until Eleanor noticed him. Her smile instantly widened. The boy walked forward. "Thank you for helping me," he said softly. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Promise me something." "What?" "When somebody needs kindness, do not wait for permission." The boy nodded. Around them, dozens of riders stood silently. Even the town seemed to hold its breath. Because in that simple moment, everyone present understood the same truth. The strongest person in Maple Ridge had never worn a badge, carried authority, or demanded attention. She had simply spent a lifetime choosing compassion. The crowd slowly began to disperse as the morning sun climbed higher above Maple Ridge. One by one, conversations resumed. Store owners reopened their doors. Families continued down the sidewalks. Yet something in the town had changed. People looked at Eleanor Brooks differently now. Not because she wanted attention. Not because she had asked for recognition. But because the truth had finally caught up with the quiet life she had lived for so many years. Frank Donovan stood beside his motorcycle near the edge of the square. The riders were preparing to leave. Engines remained silent for the moment. Nobody seemed eager to rush the goodbye. Eleanor walked toward him carrying the small wooden box beneath one arm. The sunlight reflected softly across its worn surface. "You did not need to come all this way," she said. Frank smiled. "Yes, we did." Eleanor shook her head gently. "You all have families. Responsibilities. Lives." Frank looked toward the riders gathered nearby. "Most of us still have those things because of you." For a second neither spoke. The breeze moved through the trees lining Main Street. Flags hanging outside storefronts fluttered softly. Somewhere in the distance a church bell rang. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. The same one that had traveled across decades. He studied it one final time before handing it to Eleanor. "Keep it," he said. "It belongs with you." Eleanor accepted the photograph carefully. Her eyes lingered on the younger faces frozen in time. Some of the people in that picture were still standing nearby. Others had long since passed on. Yet their stories remained. Their gratitude remained. Frank placed a hand over his heart. Several riders followed his example. Then more. Until nearly every rider standing in the square had done the same. No speeches. No grand gestures. Just quiet respect. Across the street, Officer Ryan Mercer watched from the station steps. The events of the past 24 hours weighed heavily on him. For the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning things he had stopped questioning years ago. Assumptions. Judgments. The ease with which people could be misunderstood. He slowly walked across the street toward Eleanor. The crowd noticed. Conversations faded again. Ryan stopped a few feet away. Eleanor looked at him calmly. The same calm she had carried from the very beginning. Ryan hesitated before speaking. Miss Brooks, I owe you an apology. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him. Eleanor simply listened. I thought I understood who you were. Ryan continued. I was wrong. A long silence followed. Then Eleanor smiled softly. Not triumphantly. Not proudly. Just kindly. The good thing about being wrong, she said, is that it gives you a chance to become better. Ryan lowered his eyes briefly. The simplicity of her answer struck harder than any accusation could have. Eleanor extended her hand. After a moment, Ryan shook it. The tension dissolved. Not because everything had been erased, but because understanding had finally entered where assumptions once stood. Minutes later, motorcycles began rolling away from Maple Ridge in small groups. Chrome flashed beneath the afternoon sun as riders disappeared down the highway. Frank was among the last to leave. Before climbing onto his motorcycle, he looked back once more. Eleanor stood beside the courthouse square holding the photograph against her chest. Frank nodded. Eleanor nodded back. Then he rode away. The sound of engines gradually faded into the distance until only the wind remained. By evening, Maple Ridge looked exactly as it had before. The same streets. The same buildings. The same people. Yet something invisible lingered in the air. A reminder. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor sat on her front porch beneath the old oak trees. The grandfather clock ticked softly through the open window behind her. She placed the photograph beside her, and watched the golden light fade across the neighborhood. No reporters came. No celebrations followed. Just peace. The kind earned through a lifetime of quiet choices. The kind that never demanded recognition. Across the street, children laughed as they rode bicycles home for dinner. Birds settled into the branches overhead. Evening arrived gently. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment and smiled. Because some debts are never repaid with money. Some are repaid with loyalty. Some with memory. And some with the simple truth that kindness, no matter how quietly given, always finds its way back home.